you're taking a two-dimensional representation. You're saying these two people are the same. And then the reason that they measure differently is because you're measuring it in a minimum of 3 dimensions. Good morning. Happy Tuesday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. All right. A little bit of a busy Tuesday, so we're going to dig right into today's Q&A, and this is with Pratyush. We've talked to Pratyush before. He had an interesting question in regards to 2 athletes that came with the same general physical appearance. So he's looking at posture as a representation of what he thought they should measure, and they did measure differently. And so this takes us in the direction of understanding why I don't like to talk about the imaginary planes too much, because if we start thinking in planes, then we assume that we should see these same representations, or if we get similar measures, that we would have the same thing happening on both sides of the body, and that's not necessarily true. What we need to understand is that as we're measuring, we have movement on the table. If we're doing table tests, or as people move through space, they're going to use compensatory strategies to compensate for limitations in movement. And so this is what we're talking about as we go through this Q&A. So I think it'll be helpful for a lot of people to see how you can have different measures with what appears to be the same representation. So thank you, Pratyush, for asking this question. If you would like to do a 15-minute consultation, please go to askbillhartman@gmail.com, askbillhartman@gmail.com. Put 15-minute consultation in the subject line so I don't delete it. We'll arrange that at our mutual convenience. Everybody have an outstanding Tuesday, and I will see you tomorrow. We are recording, and the clock has started. Pratyush, what's your question?
So Bill, I have 2 athletes, so this is more of a case study. So when I looked in from the side, they both present with a flat lumbar spine, but increased thoracic and cervical curves. But when I table test them, say athlete 1, he has limited bilateral straight leg raise. He has good ER and IR on the right side, but limited ER and IR on the left side. So this is athlete 1, but athlete 2, he has like 90-ish, or almost straight leg raise. They did bilateral ER, hip ER, and 30-ish hip IR. So my question is,
so go back to the 1 second. Go back to the hip IR on the second athlete.
30-ish.
How much?
30.
30-ish IR. So
yeah.
Okay. All right.
So my question is, like, when I have these athletes who look sort of similar from the side, but like they present with completely different ranges of motion. So like, what's happening there?
Well, so step 1, when you're looking at them, and you're looking at them in a 2-dimensional representation, it doesn't really give you any information in regards to what you're looking at. So you always hear me talk about moving in space, right? I don't measure things in straight planes for that reason. So you're taking a 2-dimensional representation. You're saying these 2 people are the same. And then the reason that they measure differently is because you're measuring it in a minimum of 3 dimensions. So you have to account for the turns as you're performing these measures. So you can't throw a blanket statement and say, everybody that looks like this from the side is the same, because they're not. Obviously, they're not. Okay. So if you look at the commonality for these guys, is like they have limited hip ER. So you know that wherever you have the limited hip ER, you've got an anterior orientation of the pelvis. So you understand that, correct? Okay. And then if I have limited hip IR on top of that, I've got an anterior compression. So we're just talking about movement within the pelvis right now. Okay. When I see somebody that appears to have a lot of hip IR, where it's kind of a bit of a surprise that they would have that under the circumstances, I think you're correct in assuming that you're getting a lot of spinal rotation associated with that measure. So as you're performing the hip rotation measure, the spine is turning away. And so the internal rotation that appears to be coming from the hip is actually that whole pelvis moving as a unit, which is turning the spine away. All right.
Yeah.
Now, if I've got anti-orientation in both situations, which you probably do, I'm going to have a similar representation in the thorax. And so that's going to make the thorax appear to be flattened on the backside and tipped forward as well. So you're just seeing the iterative effects in the anatomy of the orientation under those circumstances. But again, you can't just look at this thing in 2 dimensions. So in your first representation, the first athlete, because of the way that their ERs and IRs are represented, they're just more turned than the second athlete is. So both athletes are anteriorly oriented, both athletes are coming forward, but one is turning more than the other. So the first representation is just showing you that there's more turn. Okay.
More turn on the left side, like his left side is more forward than the right, right?
Correct, because so and they gave you a little bit of a clue. So the first athlete was complaining about some left-sided lower back pain.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So quite often, if you have a compressive strategy there, so a compressive strategy would be that side pushed forward more, right? So we have more of the internal rotation represented in the spine, right? So we have a correlation there. And so now we can say, well, maybe that's why they're complaining about this left side low back pain, because they're just turned more to the right by getting pushed forward more on the left side. Right. But this is why you want to take people through activities. And if you're the type of person that does tests on the table in situations where maybe you're working with somebody with pain, this is why you do those measures, is because you can't just make a blanket statement based on a visual representation. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that visual representations aren't helpful. It just means that they can't be absolute. Okay, we still have to have confirmation by watching people move and determining what behaviors we're actually observing. Okay. But again, that's why you do this. That's why you have people go through movement, complex movements like squats and toe touches and turns and anything else that you find valuable, right? You can use any movement as a representation to track over time for change, right? You just have to understand a little bit more about what you're observing.
So Bill, the first thing would be to get these athletes back, like shift their weight back.
Well, if they're oriented anteriorly, yes, but I think that in the case of the first athlete, where you have more of the turning, now you're going to have to determine, it's like, do I need to bring them back first and then turn them, or can I just turn them? So again, that's going to be your determination. My best guess would be the fact that because the first athlete's straight leg raise is limited on both sides, you're going to have to bring him straight back first, most likely. Okay. Just simply because it's like, that's indicative of the fact. So they've got a lot of spinal orientation that's allowing them to access the internal rotation, but you don't have a straight leg raise. So that means you've got the posterior lower compressive strategy that you're going to have to resolve as well. Okay. So posteriorly orient, reduce the posterior lower compressive strategy, and then you can probably make the turn.
And also, what do you mean when you say that you don't look at people in a single plane? Like, you just don't look at their body.
The planes don't exist. The planes don't exist. So I don't worry about them. Right. Yeah. The planes are to have a discussion about where things are in space. They are not representative of movement. Okay. So if you and I are having a talk and we're like we are now, and we want to know where you're putting someone in space, we could say that, oh, they're in this, your coordinate system, the XYZ coordinates, right? 3 dimensions. So we can use that to have a conversation, but people don't move in those planes because they're not there. They don't exist there. Okay. We move via the change in the shape, right? And so that's the thing. That's what we're doing when we're taking our measures. We're trying to determine what what shape are they in space, because that determines what movement you have access to, right?
So like Bill, when an athlete shows up at your door, do you like typically do these table tests, or do you have some other assessments that you go through in order to have a clear picture of where somebody is?
It honestly, it really depends on what our purpose is. You know, when I work I have my little purple room where I'll see people that, and typically they're coming to me with a problem, typically associated with pain. And in those cases, we'll do complex movements, as we always do. So we'll, where the whole body's involved. So like toe touches and squats and split squats and things like that, right? So we determine what it looks like, how they're moving in space. What can they access? What can they not access? So we have a comparator. So complex movements make great comparators because they do involve the whole body. If necessary, you put them on the table, and then you try to measure things in relative isolation, which is never possible. The whole body is involved in every movement. So if I'm measuring a hip, internal and external rotation, the entire body is moving as I am creating that. But what I'm trying to discern is, do they have relative motions available to them that may allow them to distribute loads and forces? So again, with pain, in a lot of cases, we have a reduction in the adaptability. And so most people don't distribute load and force well, and therefore they load structure or an area where there could be increased pressures, reduced circulation, and any number of things that would contribute to a pain experience.
Okay. And apart from this, Will, like the second athlete, like who has limited bilateral ER.
Yes, sir.
And he has a straight leg raise of like 90-ish. So what would be your like the lowest hanging fruit? What would you do with him first?
The biggest issue that you have, okay, so here's what you have. You have limited hip ER, okay? And then you have a lot of hip IR, okay? So again, if I have the anterior orientation, the chances of me not having the anterior compression is pretty slim. And so in this case, your internal rotation is coming from the spinal rotation. The fact that you have a straight leg raise that appears to be normal, you have to recognize where you're actually measuring this. So the fact that, let me grab my pelvis here real quick. When you've got the limitations in the hip ranges of motion, and then you see this what, like I said, what appears to be a normal straight leg raise, you're not measuring in this straight line. Again, that's why this plane doesn't matter. So you think you're doing a straight leg raise in the imaginary sagittal plane, when the reality is you have a spine that's turning away from you as you're measuring. So you're measuring out here. Okay, which is going to be a more internally rotated position, because as I raise the leg up, the pelvis turns away. And so it looks like, oh, I have 90 degrees of straight leg raise. So then the assumption is that everything's okay there, but then it doesn't jibe with any of your other tests, right? So it doesn't make sense. If you were truly measuring in this straight ahead line, you should have normal external rotations and a normal straight leg raise that go together, but you don't. You have a limited external rotation and what appears to be a normal straight leg raise. So you just have to understand where you're actually measuring in space. That's why I don't like to use the reference of a straight plane. That's why you can't make an assessment in 2 dimensions and make an assumption that you know everything about this person, especially again in athlete 1 that you were talking about. We have a much more significant turn that's taking place. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. You just got a little bit of time left.
How much time do I have left, Bill?
Less than 2 minutes, my friend.
Okay. So, Bill,
No
like,
pressure.
first, is there a limit? Is there a limit to the number of questions that one can ask through emails? Like,
well, I have a personal limit of how much time I have to spend on it, but you're welcome to ask me more questions.